Last week I was there, I'm sure you saw them, that said Bidenomics. When he talks about the economy, that is Bidenomics.
The White House is also used to turn MAGAnomics to contrast Biden's policies with Trump's. And Trump today, meanwhile, decried what he called the worst inflation in decades and a terrible economy. New inflation numbers are expected to be rolled out next week. Reporting from the White House, Iris Howe, NTD News.
Will Tucker Carlson be former President Trump's running mate in 2024? The talk show host now reportedly responding to the rumors. This as Trump expands his lead in a new 2024 poll. NTD's Arian Pastar has an election update.
Former Fox News host Tucker Carlson reportedly responding to speculation about running for vice president alongside former President Trump. Carlson was reportedly asked about the issue at a Christmas gala and responded very loud. Go from well-paid street schizophrenic to a politician. It's just kind of hard to envision. Tucker's comments came just hours after Axios reported on these speculations. And according to the outlet, it is Melania Trump who wants Tucker to run besides the former president. Now, the talk show host previously said he has no interest at all in positions of power, but he didn't rule it out when he was asked on Thursday. At the same time, a new Emerson College poll found that Trump maintains a 47 to 43% lead over President Biden in a hypothetical 2024 matchup. And Trump's lead increases when taking other candidates into account. In one scenario, the poll found Trump would get 43%, Biden 37%, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. 7%, and Jill Stein and Cornel West 1% each. And looking at the GOP primaries, Emerson found Trump leading with a strong 64%, way ahead of all other Republican candidates. This comes.
Well, thanks. So I want to first talk about the pretty rosy jobs report that just came out today. Many economists saying the state of the labor force is strong. Of course, President Biden is taking this opportunity to credit his policies for this. Peter, does this indicate the economy is looking up?
No, in fact, I don't think there's anything to take credit for. First of all, the jobs number, sure, was better than expected, but we'll probably end up revising it to worse than expected next month. That's pretty much what they do. They come out with a number, and then the following month, they revise it lower. But even if you look at the, I think, 199,000 jobs, 24% of those jobs were just striking auto workers or, motion picture workers going back to jobs they already had because they settled their strike. So that's not really job creation.
Yeah,
and then
right.
82% of the rest of the jobs that were created were government jobs and healthcare jobs. So these are not, the productive jobs that are, you're producing goods that we need, that we can consume, that we can export. And all these government workers have to be paid for by the private sector. That means the government has to run even bigger deficits. That means they have to create more inflation to pay their salaries. That puts more upward pressure on prices. So, I don't think we have a strong labor market. Meanwhile, of course, the jobs that we are creating are part-time jobs. They're low-wage jobs. People are taking second and third jobs because the economy is so weak that you can't get by on one job anymore. So most people need multiple jobs.
All right. Well, thank you for breaking that down for us. It's quite different than what we see from many of the news reports that are out there right now in the headlines. I just wanted to move on to talk about the fact that the price of gold hit a record high earlier this week, but now, of course, we know that's gone down to normal. But about the fact that it did hit a record high, but the fact that people did buy gold more, what does that say about the state of the economy?
Well, I think if people really understood how bad it is and how much worse it's going to get, they'd be buying a lot more gold because inflation is a huge problem and it's only going to get worse. The talk of the Fed successfully returning inflation to 2%, that's all talk. It's not going to happen. The genie is out of the bottle. There's no putting it back in. In the meantime, we're headed for a severe recession. In fact, I think we're going to have a worse financial crisis than the one we had in 2008. In fact, we'd already be in it if it wasn't for the bailouts of the banks earlier in the year, back in March. But that has a short shelf life. I think the problems that underlie the banking system are building. The entire banking system is insolvent based on more than 10 years of 0% rates. They've loaded up on low-yielding long-term bonds. They're underwater in those positions. Meanwhile, I think, The real economy is weakening. The deficits are skyrocketing. The structural deficits, the national debt, it's almost 34 trillion now, but it's rising by several trillion a year. And more importantly, the interest cost is skyrocketing. It's now almost $1 trillion a year. By the end of next year, it will be $2 trillion a year. We'll be paying more for interest on the national debt than we do for Medicare or Social Security. And this.
Some of us sold land to move to other places where we thought it would be better.
But isn't that a free will, and it's a choice?
It is free will. It is free will, but it's also a miscalculation.
So what is your advice to people who think about selling their land?
Hold on to your land. Hold on to that wealth. Hold on to it and build on it. Build on that land. Whatever you have to build to make it more profitable, whether it's crops, but make it work for you. We have a situation, Armstrong, that we have to create our opportunities. And there are three basic ways to do it. Through the legal system, through education, and through voting. All else falls as subcategories to those three fundamental areas. If we're not educated, if we don't fight the legal fights through the courts, if we don't get an education, we're going to lose.
One of the, I think the most important parts of your book is the structure of the family.
I'm sorry?
It's the structure of the family, men in the household, men raising their sons, sons having fathers. And talk about the need for men of character and discipline and sacrifice and leadership.
You know, Marvin Gaye used to write about things like the children. The children are the leaders of our future. And if we don't give them strong moral principles, if we don't raise them to understand what America is about and what it's for and who benefits from it, we lose.
What do you think the greatest progress, and we're talking to virtual realm in his new book, In Pursuit of America's Promise, what do you think the greatest work needs to be done?
Voting.
Voting.
Yes. I think
To you, it doesn't matter whom they vote for, you just want them to vote.
Vote.
Vote, okay.
Vote. Progress that we've made has been made through voting.
The ballot.
Absolutely. You are from South Carolina. I am originally from Louisiana. The South is the salvation for America because that's where the votes are. That's where our people are, that's where African Americans are. And if we don't target, I don't care what party you belong to, but our salvation, where we can build on, is by voting.
Virtual Morel is our guest, the author of In Pursuit of America's Promise. We'll be back with some final.
Neck believed it was an entrance wound. Several of them saw a gaping hole in the back of JFK's head. Specifically, just as the statement alluded to, within minutes of President Kennedy's arrival at the hospital, the attending doctors concluded that the neck wound was actually an entrance wound, and the head wound, it was an exit wound. For instance, here's what Dr. Robert McClellan, who was the assistant professor of surgery at Parkland Hospital back in the year 1963, here's what he said in the interview regarding the matter. Quote, "The fatal wound came from the front, I think, and other people believe that too." This was then reinforced by another doctor, Dr. Ronald Jones, who said the following, quote, "We thought that there was an entrance wound in the neck and an exit wound in the back of the head." However, this accounting of events is clearly at odds with the official narrative, because if an entrance wound did in fact come in through the front of the neck, that would mean that logically another shooter positioned somewhere in front of the motorcade would have had to been involved. And so this evidence from the Parkland doctors, it was essentially a thorn in the side of the official narrative, a narrative promulgated by both the Warren Commission and then subsequently by the CIA, that there was a single lone gunman positioned in the 6th floor of a building behind the motorcade. For instance, here's how there's general discrepancy between the official narrative and the doctor's versions of events. Here's how it was described by Dr. Ronald Jones during the interview. Quote, "So we were thinking there were two wounds. Had to be an entrance wound on the neck and an exit wound on the back of the head. That was the only way that we could put it together. And so I thought it was an entrance wound. In retrospect, if Mr. Oswald was in the 6th floor depository, how could he have been shot from the front then? And so was there more than one assailant?" And according to the testimony from these doctors, there was strong pressure applied to them from the top in order to keep a lid on their version of events. For instance, one of the doctors, he described a press conference that was held shortly after JFK was pronounced dead, wherein the lead surgeon, Dr. Malcolm Perry, he described what he found, and then subsequently, he was threatened from ever repeating it again. Quote, so at the press conference, Dr. Perry, in describing the throat wound here, and he said that he thought it looked like an entrance wound. However, when Dr. Perry left the room, someone came up to him, who Dr. Perry thought maybe was a Secret Service man, and he told Dr. Perry, you must never, ever say that was an entrance wound again if you know what's good for you. Dr. McClellan then added the following, quote, in all probability, there was a conspiracy, i.e., there was more than one shooter. However, it appears that the testimony from these doctors was suppressed, and the general American public is only now, 60 years after the fact, hearing about their perspective from that day. Or rather, I should say, there was a small period of time right after the assassination where their testimony and their analysis was in the public sphere, but within about a year, in September, when the Warren Commission report actually came out, these doctors were pretty much no longer mentioned. Furthermore, I should mention, as a part of this investigation, these doctors were shown pictures from JFK's autopsy, which they had never looked upon before as a group together, and all 7 of the doctors, they concluded that the images looked different to what they actually saw in the trauma room, leading them to believe that the body had actually been tampered with between those 2 periods of time. For instance, here's what Dr. Kenneth Saylor said upon seeing the images. Quote, when I saw the autopsy pictures, I thought somebody had tampered with the whole thing, and it made me very suspicious. And so, there you have it. Another data point which alludes to the possibility of there being another shooter present on that fateful day. If you'd like to check out the full documentary with all the testimonies from these doctors, I'll throw a link to it down in the description box below. Just for your reference, that documentary is on Paramount Plus. I personally have no financial relationship with them. I'm just leaving the link down in the description box below for your convenience, if you're the type of person that is interested in watching those doctors' testimonies for yourself. And then lastly, with Black Friday upon us, I have a great deal to share with you. If you, or someone you know, is looking for a source of actual, honest, wholesome news, well, you, or they, can check out the Epoch Times. That's because we recently extended our awesome sale on subscriptions. Just 25 cents a week for the whole year, which if you do the math, works itself out to just be $1 a month. And so, if you'd like to get access to some of the best content on the web, including I should mention that I myself publish anywhere between 1 to 3 exclusive episodes of Facts Matter over on Epoch TV, well, now's a great time to check it out. I'll throw a link to the sale page. It'll be right there at the top of the description box below. You can just click on that link. It'll take you to the sale page where you can, again, try the Epoch Times for just $1 a month. You can, of course, cancel anytime, but I'm sure that you won't. I'm sure that you'll fall in love with it and be a subscriber for a long, long, long time to come. So again, that link is right there at the top of the description box below. I hope you check it out. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed. Most importantly, stay free. If in the opinion of the governor or of some political appointee of the governor, if you are someone who poses a health threat to the community or to the state, they can lock you away. And what's interesting here is that the provisions in this bill were so purposefully vague that they could mean many different things based on interpretations. They said that the person can be put away in a medical facility or other appropriate facility or premise. Now, what does that exactly mean? It's not clear, and it gives tremendous latitude to both the governor as well as to the New York Department of Health. In fact, when I first read this bill, it gave me very Executive Order 9066 vibes. If you know, Executive Order 9066 was what President Roosevelt used to set up internment camps for the Japanese during World War II. But in that executive order, if you actually read it, it says something along the lines of, if you are a person who is deemed to be a threat to national security, you're going to be moved to an inland relocation center. And so you see how the language there was opaque as well. It's very vague. It doesn't say exactly what it is. It doesn't necessarily outline exactly who it is. And it definitely doesn't say anything about internment camps. They're called relocation centers. And so, likewise, with this bill out in New York, that's the same kind of language that they were using. And it's exactly this opaque language which would allow the governor to, just as an example, designate unvaccinated individuals as a group, place those people into one of these medical facilities, and then, this is what the bill goes on to say could be done to these people once they are actually in these medical facilities. Quote, the government would be able to require an individual who has been exposed to or infected by a contagious disease to complete an appropriate prescribed course of treatment, preventative medication, or vaccination, including directly observed therapy to treat the disease and follow infection control provisions for the disease. The provisions of this section shall not be construed to permit or require the forcible administration of any medication without a prior court order. Meaning that if you ever find yourself in this situation, you better hope that the judge overseeing the court is on your side. Now, there is something worth noting here, which is that if you read the actual text of Assembly Bill 416, it does go on to say that no one shall be held for more than a period of 60 days. But there's also a caveat which says that it allows the court to issue an order to waive the maximum detention time. And so after the initial 60 days, the court is allowed an additional 90 days to consider the detention of that individual, which is a cycle that, at least in theory, can go on indefinitely at the sole discretion of the Department of Health. Furthermore, according to the actual text of the bill, it doesn't make any mention of COVID. And so in theory, it can apply to any contagious diseases altogether, such as HIV, AIDS, hepatitis, or whatever else might come next. However, as wild as this story already is, it actually gets wilder. Because you see, the way that it's all played out is that this particular bill received such heavy blowback, it wasn't even able to find a co-sponsor, and therefore it was removed from the legislative calendar, meaning that the bill essentially died on arrival. But that was absolutely not the end of the story, because Governor Kathy Hochul, she essentially went around the state legislature and she implemented this new law in the form of a state regulation. That's because, like many other states across America, the state of New York has a fairly large book compiling the rules and regulations of the state. It's called the NYCRR, the New York Codes, Rules, and Regulations, and essentially it's a large compilation that's maintained by the executive branch of government, the State Department specifically, and it contains within it all the different codes, rules, and regulations which are enforced within the state. It's a large compilation covering everything from banking to transportation to social services, and also, relevant to our discussion today, to health. And back in April of last year, in April of 2022, which for reference was just 4 months after Assembly Bill 416 died, the New York Department of State, under the leadership of Governor Kathy Hochul, they made a significant change to New York regulations. Specifically, they added another section called Section 2.13, Isolation and Quarantine Procedures. And the powers that this new regulation gave to the governor, as well as to her political appointees, well, it mirrors exactly what was in that earlier bill that died on arrival. For instance, under the subsection titled Duty to Issue Isolation and Quarantine Orders, here's what it says, quote, whenever appropriate to control the spread of a highly contagious communicable disease, the State Commissioner of Health may issue and or may direct the local health authority to issue isolation and or quarantine orders consistent with due process of law to all such persons as the State Commissioner of Health shall determine appropriate. The new rule then goes on to explain how these quarantined individuals, once they're removed from their homes, can be placed into, quote, temporary housing locations that the public health authority issuing the order determines appropriate. And then afterwards, there are several more subsections outlining the specifics of how these quarantined individuals can be treated once they are placed into these temporary housing locations, including things like this, quote, if the location of isolation or quarantine is a detached structure, then the person may go outside while remaining on the premise, but shall not leave the premise or come within 6 feet of any person who does not reside on the premise or such other distance as may be appropriate for the specific disease. And so, just to summarize, after Assembly Bill 416 was dead on arrival, there was no way it was going through the state legislature, these new regulations were placed onto the books by the executive branch, giving the unelected bureaucrats over in the Department of Health the power to pick and choose who they want to detain if they believe there's even a possibility that this particular individual or group of individuals has a communicable disease. They also, by the way, don't have to prove that they're actually sick. Furthermore, once this person is determined to be a threat, they can be detained either in their home or they can be taken from their home and placed into a facility. And the length of the stay in the facility, well, that's purely at the government's discretion. If all this sounds familiar to you, well, that might be because you've been following the developments over in communist China over the last several years. Regardless, once this regulation was put into place, a lawsuit was filed against it, arguing that it was, for one, a violation of people's constitutional rights, as well as, secondly, a power grab on the part of the executive branch, since essentially they created a new law out of thin air, something that only the legislative branch could do. For reference, in that lawsuit, you had multiple different plaintiffs, including State Senator George Borrello, as well as New York Assemblyman Chris Tague and Mike Lawler. Mike Lawler, by the way, he went on to become a congressman, but at the time that this lawsuit was filed, which was last year, he was, in fact, a state assemblyman. And this case, it bounced around the legal system for a while until, in July of last year, in July of 2022, a New York State Supreme Court judge, he went ahead and he ruled against Governor Hochul. And while the judge struck down this forced quarantine regulation on the grounds that it violated the separation of powers, he also wrote this in his official decision, quote, involuntary detention is a severe deprivation of individual liberty, far more egregious than other health safety measures, such as requiring mask wearing at certain venues. Involuntary quarantine may have far-reaching consequences, such as loss of income or employment and isolation from family. However, the New York government did not take this loss lying down. That's because after this ruling at the trial court level, Governor Kathy Hochul, as well as Attorney General Letitia James, they went ahead and they appealed the decision. And wouldn't you know it, about a year and a half after the initial ruling, the appeals court went ahead and they ruled in favor of Governor Kathy Hochul. And their reasoning was not what you'd expect. Instead of going through the actual merits of the case, the panel of 5 judges, they decided that the plaintiffs in the case actually lacked standing to bring the case forward at all. Meaning that these judges determined that a state senator, as well as 2 members of the state assembly, they somehow did not have standing to bring forth a lawsuit against the governor when she essentially usurps legislative authority from the state assembly. Although it does raise the question, if the state representatives themselves don't have standing to sue in this particular situation, who would? Regardless, the lawyer who's pushing this case forward, Ms. Bobby Ann Cox, was, as you could imagine, not too pleased with this ruling. Here's how she described the situation over during an interview on NTD News.
So now this appellate court, which, of course, the governor and the attorney general appealed to this court, they tried to overturn our decision. And yeah, the court came down and said, well, you know what? We're not even going to talk about the merits here, whether or not this regulation was unconstitutional or not. We're just going to say, hey, you know what? We don't think you had the right to bring the lawsuit in the first place last year.
And what's your assessment of that decision? What's your assessment of the reasoning here?
Yeah, it's pretty surprising, I have to say. The trial court judge last year didn't even discuss standing. It was an argument that was brought up by the Attorney General last year at the trial court, but it's so obvious that we have standing that the trial court judge didn't even discuss it in his decision. So it was very surprising, and I don't agree. My plaintiffs and I do not agree with this ruling. We do not believe that sitting New York State legislators and the people of New York State, in a citizens group, don't have standing. It doesn't make sense. So we definitely disagree with this ruling. The other problem is that this is really bad case law. An appellate court is saying that these legislators don't have the right to bring a lawsuit against the executive branch of government when they feel that the executive branch of government has usurped their power, has taken their power to make law. It's very clear, 3 branches of government, each branch has its own job, its own authority, and here it was clear that the executive branch overstepped and reached into the legislative branch's powers. You have to be able to challenge that in court.
Now, moving forward, Ms. Bobby Ann Cox, as well as the plaintiffs, they can still appeal this ruling to the Albany-based New York State Court of Appeals. However, until that court decides whether or not they're even going to take up the appeal, the reality is that here in the state of New York, Governor Kathy Hochul can go ahead and she can reinstate Section 2.13, putting the nearly 20 million people who live in the state of New York at risk of getting quarantined if the state determines it necessary. However, if all this sounds to you like the government is giving itself the authority to set up quarantine camps, well, you should absolutely stop worrying, because the Associated Press put out a fact check saying that this is not the case. In this quote-unquote fact check of theirs, their argument is since New York officials repeatedly denied having any intention of building quarantine camps, then obviously it's false. Here's in fact what that Associated Press fact check says. Quote, nothing in the rule mentions camps, nor suggests that the state has plans to erect them. And that is technically true. Nowhere in Section 2.13 does it mention the word camps. Instead, it mentions temporary housing locations that you won't be able to leave without the government's permission. If you see any resemblance to that and the word camps, that's really just on you. Jokes aside, though, it's exactly this type of quote-unquote fact check which completely shatters people's trust in the media. The Associated Press, they go to the officials within the New York government and they ask them, hey, are you planning to set up quarantine camps? They say, no, we're not. And that's it. Fact check false. Despite the obvious fact that even if they're not planning to do so now, this rule, once it's actually enacted, will give them the legal authority to do so in the future. And that's really the crux of the issue here, because COVID has obviously passed. But let's say a year from now, 2 years from now, or 10 years from now, when the next COVID-like pandemic comes around, whoever's living in the state of New York will suddenly discover that, hey, the government here has a lot more power than I initially thought, all because of some obscure section in an obscure rule book that the New York State courts allowed to stand. If you'd like to dig deeper into section 213, I'll throw all my research notes down into the description box below this video for you to peruse, including I'll also throw the entire video of the oral arguments that were presented in the court, including both the government side as well as the side that was fighting against the rule. If you'd like to watch the entirety of those oral arguments, I'll throw the link to it down in the...
Stay tuned to get this 5-piece bakeware set, a $60